Before cities rose and before empires claimed the earth, there were just people under the night sky. People who looked up and wondered why they were here. Some became stargazers, dreamers who watched the heavens for meaning. Others became stone builders, hands in the earth, shaping mountains into memory. Together they made history not through conquest, but through wonder. This is a story about how humans learned to live, dream, build, and remember, all while the stars stayed exactly where they've always been. The night sky was the first classroom. Long before ink formed symbols, long before clay tablets captured grain counts or royal names, long before maps claimed to describe the world, there was just the vault of stars. Endless, patient, unchanging. To the eye, every culture that ever existed looked up at that same sky, and in that shared act, humanity had its first teacher. People did not simply see points of light. They saw patterns, meaning, rhythm. They noticed how stars rose and descended in regular cycles. They paid attention to which constellations appeared in winter and which returned in spring. These patterns told them when to plant and when to harvest, when to travel and when to stay home, when herds would begin to move and when rivers would flood. The sky wasn't entertainment, it was survival. And yet, beneath survival, there was something deeper, something more human, something quiet. When our ancestors looked up, they also saw themselves, their hopes, their fears, their questions. The world during the day was a place of tasks, hunting, gathering, mending, watching children, keeping the fire alive. The daytime world was practical, necessary. The night, however, opened a door to wonder, to thought, to meaning. When the sky darkened and the world softened into shadow, life became something more than simply doing. It became thinking. People sat around fires, the flames flickering like miniature suns at the center of small universes, and above those campfires, the stars glowed. The first stories were told not out of boredom, but out of longing. Longing to explain. Longing to belong. Longing to turn the unknown into something familiar. The constellations became characters, heroes, animals, gods, ancestors. The sky was not empty. It was full of memories and lessons. In the beginning, no one said, "We are studying astronomy." There was no science, no religion as we think of it today. There was simply attention, deep, patient attention, the kind that modern life rarely allows. People watch the sky not for minutes but for seasons. They notice the slow procession of the stars across the horizon over years. Some of them must have realized that the sky itself rotated, that the world was curved, that everything was in motion. And yet they described these truths through poetry, not equations. The first knowledge lived in story. Imagine a night, thousands of years ago. A group of travelers sits far from any village, wrapped in animal hides, surrounded by cold air so still, it feels sacred. The fire crackles softly. Above them there is no haze of city lights, only stars so bright they seem close enough to touch. One of the elders points to a line of stars and begins to speak. He tells of a hunter who chased a great beast across the heavens. The group listens, not because the story is new, but because it is old. Stories were repeated not to inform, but to remember. In remembering, they were not simply preserving the past. They were preserving identity. To know the constellations was to know who you were. To know the sky was to know your place in the great pattern of things. In those days, knowledge was not stored in books, it was stored in bodies. Fingers that pointed to the horizon at a certain angle during a certain season. Voices that repeated the pattern of stars in song. Feet that walked migration routes at the exact time indicated by the returning constellation. Memory was muscle. Knowledge was breath. To learn was to live. And so the sky became a mirror. The vastness above allowed humans to see the vastness within themselves. The stars reminded them that life was not merely about survival. It was about meaning. A meaning that could not be touched, only felt. People wondered why they existed, why the world was filled with both beauty and pain, why life was so fleeting and yet the sky so eternal. These questions were not philosophical in the academic sense. They were woven into everyday living. When a child was born, someone looked at the stars and said, "They have come at the time of the rising of that constellation. This must mean something." When someone died, the sky held their memory. People believed that souls rose to the stars not because of superstition, but because the stars were the only thing they saw that did not die. The sky was permanence, eternal, unchanging, a resting place for those who left the earth. As societies grew and villages became towns, and towns became cities, some people became keepers of the stars. They were astronomers, but also priests, storytellers, guides, and sometimes rulers. They climbed stone towers to measure the heavens. They carved alignments into stone temples so that light would strike a precise place on a precise day. The equinox, the solstice, the return of the rains, the beginning of the flood, the arrival of spring. These were not accidents. The sky dictated the rhythm of human life. And the people who understood that rhythm held immense responsibility. They guided planting and harvest. They determined the dates of festivals. They told leaders when to wage war and when to remain still. They interpreted the will of the cosmos. Even now, thousands of years later, we still carry that desire to find meaning in the stars. We are not so different from our ancestors. We look up during moments of decision, during heartbreak, during loneliness, during awe. The stars are still the only witnesses large enough to hold what we feel. And yet, modern life has pulled us indoors. Our world glows with artificial light. We no longer see the sky as our ancestors did. To them, the heavens were a cathedral. To us, they are often a background, but something awakens in us when we step outside at night, away from the noise, away from screens, away from the constant urgency. When we see the stars clearly, even for a moment, we remember something ancient, something older than culture, older than language. We remember that we belong to a universe that existed long before us and will continue long after us. This is not a thought meant to diminish. It is meant to soothe. In the face of the stars, our problems shrink to their proper size. Not insignificant, but temporary. The sky teaches perspective. The sky also teaches patience. The stars move slowly. Their patterns repeat across generations. Empires rise and crumble beneath them. Languages are born and forgotten. But the constellations persist. To watch the stars is to accept a slower rhythm than the one imposed on us today. A rhythm measured not in minutes, but in centuries. Our ancestors understood something we are only beginning to rediscover, that meaning cannot be rushed. That understanding comes not from constant searching, but from quiet attention. The night sky was the first invitation to stillness, to breathe, to simply exist. And there, in that stillness, people saw themselves reflected. Their longing, their curiosity, their fragility, their wonder. This is why the stars mattered. Not just because they guided travel or dictated seasons, but because they guided the heart. Even now, when we look up, something in us changes. The mind loosens its grip on worries. The heart softens. The breath deepens. We remember that being alive is not about doing all the time. Sometimes it is about being. This is the first lesson the night sky ever taught, and we are still learning it. Stones have always carried memory. Before ink, before parchment, before metal tools carved names into monuments, there were stones placed, carefully by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. Stones did not appear in circles, walls, pyramids, or pathways by accident. They were chosen, shaped, lifted, aligned, and set into place by people who believed that memory must live somewhere outside the body. Because bodies vanish, people pass, stories fade, but stones endure, at least long enough to bridge one life to another. When we look at ancient stones today, stone circles weathered by rain, temple steps worn smooth by thousands of feet, markers on forgotten hillsides, We often call them ruins. But they are not ruins. They are messages. They are reminders. They are evidence of wonder. The hands that placed them were not simply building structures, they were asking questions. Who are we? Where do we come from? What matters in a world that changes? What do we leave behind? These questions are not new. They are as old as consciousness itself. Imagine a time when the world was quiet, when nights were illuminated only by fire and stars, when the horizon was not cluttered with buildings or roads. People lived closely to the land. They knew the smell of the soil before it rained. They recognized the sound of an animal approaching, long before they could see it. They felt the seasons not as dates on a calendar, but as living presences. And yet, even in this deep intimacy with the world, or perhaps because of it, they felt the fragility of life. Food could run short. Storms could come without warning. Illness could take someone without explanation. People did not have the comforting illusion that life was guaranteed. They understood from the beginning that existence was temporary, and so they looked for ways to place permanence into the world, not to defy time but to speak across it. This is why stones were chosen. Stones resist time. They hold shape, weight, presence. They do not vanish with the seasons. A tree grows and falls. A body ages and returns to the earth. But a stone remains, unaltered, unmoved, persistent. When a stone is lifted and placed deliberately, it becomes an act of declaration. A declaration that says, we lived, we thought, we felt, we hoped. In many ancient cultures, stones were placed in circles, not for decoration, not for power, but for gathering. A circle does not have a beginning or an end. It has no hierarchy, no central throne. A circle places everyone inside it equally. Those who stood within stone circles thousands of years ago likely understood themselves not as rulers of the earth, but as participants in it. The circle reflected the cycles of life they saw in the world around them. The cycle of the moon, the seasons, the growth of plants, the migrations of animals, the arc of birth to death. A stone circle was a way of saying, we belong to this rhythm. Some stones were shaped into cairns, small stacks marking paths across landscapes. These stones guided travelers, hunters, shepherds. They were not monumental, not grand, not ceremonial. They were practical memory. They said, someone came this way before you. You are not the first, you are not alone. The path continues. Even today, when hikers add a stone to a cairn, they are participating in a tradition older than writing. The act is quiet, simple, reverent. One stone added to many. Lives layered in gesture. Other stones rose into pyramids, ziggurats, temples, structures that seem impossibly complex given the tools available at the time. And yet people built them anyway. Not because they needed to, because they needed to express something that could not be contained inside a single human life. A desire to reach upward, to touch the sky, to connect the earthly and the eternal. These monuments were not simply tombs or altars. They were bridges. Bridges between this world and whatever might lie beyond it. To stand inside a stone temple is to feel the presence of intention. Every stone placed with care. Every alignment calculated to the movement of the sun or moon. Light falling into sacred spaces at specific times of the year. These structures were not random. They were the result of generations of observation, memory, and collaboration. They were evidence of communities who believed that meaning was not just personal, it was shared. Stones were also storytellers. Carvings etched into their surfaces conveyed myth, law, genealogy, cosmology. Symbols carried across centuries, sometimes decipherable, sometimes mysterious. Even when we cannot read the words, we can sense the significance. Someone wanted to be remembered. Someone believed that the knowledge they carried mattered. Someone hoped that the future would listen. What is most striking is that many of these stones still stand. They have witnessed storms, earthquakes, wars, and the slow erosion of time, yet they remain. Meanwhile, the people who placed them have vanished entirely. their names forgotten, their voices gone, and yet through these stones they still speak. When we visit these places today, when we stand where they once stood, we often feel something more than curiosity, something like awe, something like recognition. We feel the weight of time, yes, but we also feel the closeness of those who came before us. It is as though the stone itself holds memory not just of events, but of presence, the touch of hands, the labor of bodies, the breath of voices now silent. The stone remembers even when we do not. But stones were not built only to look back. They were also built to look forward. They were placed for those yet to come, for us. They were a gift, a gesture of faith, a belief that human life, while temporary, could matter across time, that what we build, what we care about, what we love, does not disappear simply because we do. This is perhaps the most human impulse of all, the desire to be remembered, not out of vanity, but out of longing to be part of something larger, longing to contribute to the thread of existence that stretches through generations. When we build, when we create, when we lay stones in patterns, we are saying, my life mattered. I was here. I felt wonder, grief, love, fear, joy. I was human. And this is the heart of it. Stones were not built to last forever. They were built to remember, to extend memory beyond the fragile boundaries of the body, to place meaning into the world where it could endure, however briefly, against the vastness of time. Even if the stones fall someday, even if the structures collapse, even if the carvings fade, the act of building them remains. The intention lives on. The impulse lives on. And we continue that impulse today. We build monuments, memorials, gravestones, time capsules, scrapbooks, photographs, digital archives. We are still trying to place memory into the world. We are still stone builders. But perhaps we have forgotten the quiet part, the part that says we wondered about life too. We often think of ancient builders as separate from us, primitive, distant, other. But they were not. They laughed, they argued, they shared food, they held children close. They watched the sky with the same awe we feel. They mourned their dead with the same ache. They did not build because they were ignorant. They built because they understood the fragility of life deeply. If anything, their awareness was clearer than ours. They lived in a world where the line between life and death was visible. They did not have the illusion of permanence that modern life offers. And so their stones became a response to impermanence, their memory made solid. To touch an ancient stone is to touch the hand of someone who lived hundreds or thousands of years ago. The warmth is gone, but the intention remains. It is a conversation across time, a quiet one, a compassionate one, and perhaps when we build now we might remember what they were saying. We were here. We wondered about life too. So do we. And because of that, we are not separate from them. We are the continuation of their memory. We are the living stones. Now community was the oldest technology. Long before bronze was forged, before wheels turned, before written language etched itself into clay, people survived because they had each other. No stone monument was raised by one pair of hands. No temple stood because of a single mind. No circle of stones aligned with the sun or moon was the vision of one solitary architect. Everything that endured from the ancient world was built by groups, villages, clans, tribes, people living side by side, sharing work, food, sleep, and purpose. We often speak of ancient monuments as though they were the achievements of great rulers or brilliant architects, but the truth is far simpler and also far more beautiful. These structures were built by ordinary people, by neighbors, by hands that had grown calloused from working the land, by people who did not seek fame or recognition. They built because the act of building itself was part of living. In the ancient world, individuality was not the core of identity the way it is today. A person was not defined by their personal dreams or ambitions. They were defined by the people they belonged to, by whose fire they sat beside, by whom they shared bread with, by the voices they woke to in the morning and the footsteps they heard at dusk. Community was not optional. It was life itself. To modern eyes, that may seem restrictive, as though personal expression was lost. But in reality, it was something different. Something softer. Something older. People did not need to prove themselves as unique to be valued. They did not need to be exceptional to be loved. The simple fact of being part of the group meant belonging. Their existence had meaning not because of what they achieved alone, but because of how they contributed to the shared world. Identity was not a mask one had to craft. It was a natural belonging, as natural as the way a bird belongs to its flock or a tree belongs to the forest. When a stone monument was planned, it did not begin with one person drawing a design. It began with conversation, with people gathering by firelight, speaking softly, dreaming together. The idea of building something, whether to honor ancestors, to mark seasons, to align with the stars, or to shelter the community, was shared. A collective decision. The vision lived in many minds at once, and so the memory of that vision was unbreakable. If one person forgot, another remembered. Knowledge was held like embers distributed among many fires. No one person carried everything. But together, they carried more than we can imagine. When the day came to build, it was not an event. It was simply part of life. The village would rise with the sun, children would fetch water, elders would sit and watch, shaping small tasks. With slow practiced hands, men and women would lift stone, cut timber, weave rope, carry baskets of earth. Work did not belong to a single gender or age group. Work belonged to everyone. The rhythm of their bodies matched the rhythm of the seasons. There was no rush because time was not an enemy. Time was a companion. The stones would stand when they were ready. There was no schedule except the sky. During this work, conversations flowed. Stories were told and retold. Laughter echoed across fields. Songs kept pace with footsteps. Hands that were tired found strength in the presence of other hands. To work together was not only efficient, it was joyful. Not always easy. Work was tiring and life was harsh, but the burden of effort was lightened by the closeness of others. No one carried weight alone. If someone struggled, another stepped in without needing to be asked. Support was instinct, not charity, and at night when the work ended, the community returned to the hearth. Fires flickered, food was shared. There was no isolation after labor, no going home to separate rooms, separate meals, separate screens. The reward for a day of work was not privacy. It was togetherness. To sit in the circle of others and feel recognized. To share warmth. To share silence. To be seen. This kind of closeness created a different kind of knowledge. We might call it wisdom now, though it did not think of itself that way. People understood themselves not as separate beings, but as parts of a larger living body. If one person fell ill, the community felt thinner. If a child was born, the entire group felt stronger. The health of one was the health of all. And so, care was not a responsibility. It was a natural response. Compassion was not a concept. It was a rhythm of life. Food, too, was different. It was not something earned individually, purchased with private income, stored in private spaces. It was gathered and hunted together, cooked together, eaten together. There was no status in having more. There was no shame in having less. The group ensured everyone survived because the group could not survive if anyone was left behind. Hunger was shared, and so was abundance. These were not acts of generosity. They were foundational truths of existence. Some would say such systems were primitive, but perhaps they were simply honest. In the world we inherit now, individuality is celebrated, even demanded. We are told to find ourselves, define ourselves, promote ourselves, improve ourselves, protect ourselves. We speak of independence as though it is the pinnacle of achievement. We measure success by what separates us from others, not what binds us to them. And yet, despite all our freedom, all our choice, all our autonomy, loneliness spreads like a silent illness. We have built private lives so carefully that we have forgotten how to live together, We have wealth but hunger. We have houses but not always home. We have identities but not always belonging. The community our ancestors lived within, something so natural they did not even have a word for it, has become something we must now search for, and sometimes fear we will never find. Yet community was once our greatest strength. It was our survival, our comfort, our joy. It was the oldest technology, not crafted from metal or fire, but from trust. Trust built stone monuments. Trust grew crops and raised children. Trust allowed knowledge to pass from generation to generation without written language. Trust allowed life to continue through hardship. Trust meant no one faced the unknown alone. Imagine a child growing up in such a world. That child would never have to ask whether they were loved. The answer was everywhere. It was in the hands that braided their hair, in the arms that rocked them to sleep, in the songs sung softly when the night was cold. It was in the way every adult in the village watched over them, not as guardians, but as members of a shared heart. Identity was not something the child had to earn. It was given. In such a world, grief too was shared. When someone died, the loss did not belong only to one family. It belonged to everyone. The body was not hidden. People gathered, sat together, and remembered the stories of the one who was gone. They cried without shame. They touched one another's shoulders. They let sorrow move through them slowly, gently. There was no expectation to move on quickly. Time was allowed to soften grief, and because grief was shared, it never had to be endured alone. The monuments built by ancient communities reflect this closeness. They were not merely functional. They were expressions of collective identity. The stones were lifted by many hands, not just physically, but symbolically. The stones contained the weight of shared memory, shared effort, shared meaning. When we look at those stones today, we are not looking at the work of engineers. We are looking at the work of relationships. And relationships are the oldest craft humans ever learned. We learned how to form them long before we learned how to shape tools. We learned how to share long before we learned how to count. We learned how to comfort long before we learned how to explain. The oldest technology is not fire or stone or farming. The oldest technology is the ability to hold one another through life's uncertainties. This is why the ancient world built so much that lasted, not because their tools were advanced, but because their bonds were. Community was not something to strive for. It was the natural state of being alive. But something shifted in the long river of time. As societies grew larger, as resources became something to compete for instead of share, as power centralized into the hands of the few, as wealth became measurable and tradable, individuality began to rise. Not the harmless individuality of personality and expression, but the kind that separates, the kind that isolates, the kind that teaches us to measure our worth in comparison to others rather than alongside them. Monuments changed as well. Where once they were built outward, to gather people, they began to be built upward, to elevate one above many. Where once they were communal works, they became demonstrations of control. Where once they spoke quietly about belonging, they began to speak loudly about ownership, and the communities that built them began to fracture. Yet, something of the ancient way remains in us. We feel it when we cook with others, when we sit side by side in silence and feel comfort instead of pressure, when someone knocks on our door just to check in, when we share laughter around a table, when a group sings and voices blend until no single voice stands apart, when we help without expecting reward. These moments remind us that community is not gone, it is simply sleeping. We have not forgotten how to be together. We have only forgotten that we already know how. We may never return to the exact world of our ancestors, nor should we, but we can remember what they knew, that life feels fuller when shared, that the walls we build around ourselves do not protect us, they isolate us. That belonging is not a luxury, it is oxygen. The monuments that still stand across the earth, the stone circles, the cairns, the temples, The gathering places are not simply remnants of ancient architecture. They are reminders. They whisper the same truth that the night sky once taught. We need each other, not occasionally, not conveniently, but deeply. The hands that lifted those stones were guided by something more powerful than strength. They were guided by connection, a connection that made them capable of moving mountains. We are still capable of that. We always have been. If we remember how to reach for one another again, gently, honestly, without fear, the oldest technology will return to life. Not to build monuments of stone, but to build something far more enduring. A way of living where no one is alone. A way of living where belonging is not earned. A way of living where meaning is shared. A way of living that feels like being human. Time moved slowly, and that was okay. Life was once shaped not by the ticking of clocks, but by the rhythm of the earth itself. It was measured in the soft turn of the seasons, the warming of the soil, the lengthening of shadows, the migration of birds, and the ripening of fruit. People did not need to know the exact minute of the morning. They rose with the sun because light touched their eyes. They rested when darkness filled the sky because night invited silence. Time was not something to chase or conquer. It was simply something that flowed through the world, like a river that never rushed, but always knew where it was going. There was a kind of gentleness in that slower world, a world where urgency had not yet been invented, where a person did not wake with the thought of needing to become something greater than they already were. Existence itself was enough. The mere act of living, breathing, gathering food, telling stories, touching the earth, looking at the sky. These things had meaning. Life was not yet divided into achievements and failures. It was simply life, unfolding. And in that simplicity, there was peace. Imagine a small village made of wood, reeds, and stone, surrounded by open land and tall grasses swaying in the wind. A river flows nearby, not hurried, just moving steadily, nourishing everything in its quiet path. The people of the village wake to the sound of birdsong, not alarms. They stretch, they step outside. The air is cool, the day is slow. Some walk to the fields to check the crops. Others tend to animals. Children gather berries among the trees. Work is done, but it does not feel like work the way we understand it now. It is part of life, woven into the day, not separated from it. Effort is not something measured against exhaustion. It is simply the exchange between humans and the world that holds them. When the seasons changed, life changed with them. Winter taught patience, spring taught renewal, summer taught growth, autumn taught release. No season demanded anything quickly. Everything took the time it needed to become itself. Nothing bloomed before its moment. Nothing ripened because of pressure. The world knew how to unfold naturally, and people learned to trust that unfolding. There was no need to rush, because there was nowhere to rush to. The horizon was as far as the world needed to go. There were no towering goals to chase, no invisible ladder to climb. A person's value was not determined by how fast they worked, how much they owned, or how unique they were. Their value came from simply being part of the community, part of the land, part of the story that began long before they were born and would continue long after they were gone. Meaning was found not in constant progress, but in repetition. In doing the same things the same way, year after year, generation after generation, and understanding that sameness was sacred. When someone planted seeds in spring, they were repeating a gesture made by countless hands before them. When they baked bread, they followed the same steps their grandparents did. When they sang songs at night beside the fire, they were singing fragments of memories that stretched back beyond the reach of individual lives. Life was not a race. It was a circle. That circle gave comfort. It reminded people that they belonged to something bigger than themselves, but not something overwhelming. The world was large, but not too large to understand. The stars overhead were infinite, but they appeared in patterns that returned again and again. The repetition of the heavens mirrored the repetition of life on earth. Day after day, the sun rose. Night after night, the moon appeared. The cycle did not demand awe, it simply was. And because it was constant, it was calming. The idea of success, the idea of becoming, did not yet exist in the way we think of it now. There was no hierarchy of worth. A person who carved wood was not admired more than someone who wove baskets. A storyteller was not valued less than a hunter. Each person's role was part of the living web of the village. If one thread was missing, the web weakened. So every role mattered. There was no need to prove one's value. One had value by existing, by participating, by breathing the same air and sharing the same fire. And because no one rushed, the mind was quieter. Thoughts did not trip over one another, trying to outrun time. When someone sat beside a river, they could simply watch the water move. They could notice the way the sunlight sparkled on its surface. They could sit long enough to see the pattern of insects walking on the water's skin. They could watch the clouds drift by and not feel like the moment was wasted. Time was something to experience, not something to manage. Conversations were slower too. When someone spoke, others listened, truly listened, because there was time to. And when silence came, it was not awkward or heavy. Silence was simply another form of presence. It was allowed to exist. People did not need to fill every space with sound to feel real. They understood that quiet had its own voice. Meals were slower. Even when food was simple, roots, grains, fruits, herbs, it was shared. People gathered around firelight. They talked. They laughed. They remembered. The act of eating was not just about nourishment. It was about being together. The fire crackled. The air cooled as night came. The stars opened above, vast and silent. Soft conversation blended with stillness. There was nowhere else to be, nothing else to do. The moment was enough. There was no rush to become something, because people already were. They were part of the land, part of the river, part of the sky. They were part of the story written by time, not against it. They did not need to change to deserve belonging. They did not need to prove themselves to be seen. Identity was not something constructed or performed. It was simply lived. The world today moves faster. Clocks divide the day into strict boxes. Schedules stack tasks on top of one another until the weight becomes unbearable. People chase purpose, chase achievement, chase recognition, chase a future that always seems just out of reach. And the more we chase, the further meaning seems to drift. But the memory of slow time is still inside us. It lives in the quiet urge to step outside at night and look at the moon, to breathe deeply when overwhelmed, to sit beside a window and watch rain fall, to feel the sun on our skin and remember something ancient and calm. Because somewhere inside, we remember that life does not need to move fast to have meaning. We remember that being is enough. We remember that time does not always need to be conquered. Sometimes it just needs to be lived. And the world, despite everything, still moves in cycles. The sun still rises and sets. The moon still changes shape. The seasons still return one after the other. The earth has never once asked us to rush. It is we who started running. But we can walk again. We can breathe again. We can remember the rhythm that once guided everything. The slow, patient, gentle movement of a world that was never in a hurry. And when we remember, something inside us loosens. Something softens. Something rests. Time can move slowly again, and that is still okay. Wonder was a daily practice, not something rare, not something saved for special moments, not something that required poetry or philosophy to make it meaningful. It was simply part of being alive. Looking up at the stars was as ordinary as breathing, as natural as washing one's hands in a river, as expected as waking with the sun. The night sky was not entertainment. It was not a metaphor. It was just there, like the earth, like the wind, like one's own heartbeat, constant, familiar, always present, but never boring. In the world before electric light, before cities spilled their glow upward and drowned the darkness, the sky at night was breathtaking in its fullness. Thousands upon thousands of stars, sharp and clear, scattered across the deep blue-black canvas of night. The Milky Way arced overhead like a river of light, shimmering softly, a reminder of something vast and uncontainable, and every person in every place could see it. The sky belonged to everyone. No one had to travel or seek it out. You stepped outside your door and you were in the middle of the universe. People would look up not because they were searching for wisdom or meaning, but because there was nothing blocking the view. The stars were right there, and in seeing them every night, they became part of daily life. Just as one recognized the shape of the mountains, the flow of the nearby river, or the sound of the wind through leaves, one recognized the constellations as familiar neighbors. They had names, stories, personalities. They were companions in the dark. The act of looking up did not need to be accompanied by deep thought. One might look up while gathering firewood, while walking back to the village, while sitting beside a dying fire before sleep. The stars became part of the rhythm of existence, a quiet reminder that the world was bigger than fear, than work, than worry. Bigger than the small frustrations of a single day. Bigger than the small joys, too. The stars held the bigness of everything, and yet, they did not overwhelm. They did not make a person feel small in the way modern people sometimes describe when they think of the cosmos. Instead, the stars made a person feel held. The universe did not seem indifferent then. It felt like a companion, a presence, something that had been here before and would remain after, and somehow that felt comforting. The continuity of the sky was a reminder that life flowed on, that hardships passed, that joy returned, that seasons turned and turned again. The sky looked the same to grandparents and grandchildren. The same constellations rose and set long after a person's own story had ended. And because of this, the stars helped people understand that life was not a solitary journey. It was part of something ancient and ongoing. There was wonder in small things, too. In the way smoke curled upward from a fire and disappeared into the night. In the way frost formed delicate patterns on leaves. In the sound of water moving over stone. In the tracks animals left in the soil. People noticed these things because their minds were not crowded. There was space to see, to listen, to feel. Wonder did not have to be extraordinary. It could be as simple as watching a bird take flight or noticing the first flowers of spring. In that slower life, attention was not fractured. There were no glowing screens, no constant interruptions, no endless demands for productivity. The mind could rest in one place. A person could stand still and simply be aware. And from that awareness, wonder naturally arose. A child could spend hours watching ants build a hill. An elder could sit on a rock and watch clouds move across the sky. No one thought this was a waste of time. Time was not something to spend, to use, to maximize. It was something to experience. In the quiet of that world, the boundaries between self and nature were thinner. A person did not feel separate from the world. They were part of it. The stars, the trees, the animals, the stones, all were companions. Not possessions, not resources, not scenery. They were alive in a way that made them co-inhabitants of the same space. Wonder came from recognizing that connection. When night came, darkness wrapped the village gently. Firelight flickered from inside homes, casting warm golden glows on wood and stone. People gathered around the flames to share stories. Stories were not simply entertainment. They were the memory of the world made spoken. They connected the present moment to ancient time. The stars overhead listened. The fire crackled. The stories lived. A story about why the eagle flies high. A story about how the river found its path. A story about the ancestors who followed the constellations across plains and seas. A story about how the world began. The stories were not separate from reality. They were reality, expressed in a form that the mind and heart could understand. The sky was not just stars. It was a map of memory. Children listened with wide eyes, not because the stories were fantastical, but because they were true in the deepest sense. Stories explained the world, not through science or logic, but through meaning. And meaning was what people sought. Not control, not efficiency, meaning. And when the stories ended, silence came. But silence was full. It had weight, presence, texture. Silence was where wonder lived. A person could sit in silence and feel connected to the world, rather than disconnected from others or from themselves. Silence was not something to fix or fill, it was something to share. When one lay down to sleep, the stars remained overhead, visible through the cracks of a roof or the opening of a shelter, or simply out in the open under the sky. Sleep came easily, because the world felt trustworthy. The night did not feel threatening. It felt like rest. The stars kept watch. People dreamed. And dreams were also part of the world's story. A dream could guide a decision. A dream could explain a feeling. A dream could be a message. Life was not divided into waking and sleeping, into real and unreal. Everything was part of the same flow. There was no need to escape life by seeking wonder. Wonder was already woven into life. Over time, as villages grew into towns and towns into cities, the sky slowly faded from view. Walls rose. Lights multiplied. Work became more complex, more demanding, more constant. People began to measure time, then control time, then be controlled by time. Minutes became valuable. Seconds mattered. The sky was still there, but fewer. People looked up. Days became filled with tasks and ambitions. Nights became filled with lights that drowned the stars. Wonder did not disappear, but it became hidden. It became something people had to remember to seek. Yet, even now, the memory lives inside us. The old way of seeing the world has not been lost. It is just sometimes forgotten beneath layers of noise and urgency. But step outside on a clear night far from the city lights and look up. The stars are still there. The sky is still vast. The constellations still tell their stories. The universe still holds its calm presence. And something inside stirs. Something long asleep begins to wake. Something recognizes the stars as familiar, as home. The mind quiets, the breath slows, the heart softens, and wonder returns, not as something dramatic, but as something simple and ancient. Wonder is not a reaction. It is a state of being, a way of seeing the world that does not require explanation or justification. It is the recognition that life is not small, that existence is not an accident, that beauty is everywhere, always waiting to be noticed. Wonder was a daily practice once, and it can be again. Not by changing the world, but by changing how we look at it, by slowing down, by breathing, by remembering that the world is not only made of tasks and responsibilities, it is also made of stars, of rivers, of firelight, of wind, of stories, of silence. The sky is still above us, the earth is still beneath us, we are still here. We have not lost the ability to look up, we have only forgotten that we once did. Even now, in the modern world, with all its noise and speed and complexity, we are still doing both. We are still stargazers, and we are still stone builders. We still look up to the sky for meaning, and we still shape the earth to hold our memories. The tools have changed. The landscapes have changed. The pace of life has changed. But the longing itself, the deep old longing to understand, to belong, to leave something behind, that has not changed at all. A person today may no longer live in a small village where the night sky stretches unhindered across the horizon. They may live in a city of tall buildings, bright lights, constant motion. They may spend their days working under ceilings instead of open skies, walking on pavement instead of earth, listening to machines instead of wind. But somewhere inside, in the quiet parts of the mind that still remember what the body remembers, there remains a pull toward the sky, toward the vastness that makes everything small but meaningful, toward the sense that life is part of something far greater than what we can see or control. Someone might step outside late at night, after a long day, and look up. And even if the stars are faint or few, something stirs. The breath slows, the thoughts soften. The body remembers that long before stress and schedules and expectations there was simply existence. Simply being alive under the same sky that has watched over countless generations. The stars are not gone, even when hidden. The connection is not gone even when forgotten. It returns the moment we pause. We still dream. We still wonder what lies beyond. We send telescopes into space to see further than any human eye could reach. We send spacecraft to other planets. We search for signs of life in distant galaxies. We ask whether we are alone, not because we need an answer, but because asking the question feels ancient and necessary. The same curiosity that led early people to map constellations, to imagine gods and stories among the stars, now leads scientists to decode cosmic, radiation, and chart spiral galaxies. The language changed, the instruments changed, but the longing is the same. We still want to understand where we are in the great expanse of existence. We are still stargazers, even when we look through screens instead of sky. And we are still stone builders too. We still shape the earth to hold memory. Our stones now are concrete, steel, glass, glowing screens, server rooms full of digital archives. Our pyramids are skyscrapers, bridges, monuments, libraries, museums. Our carvings are photographs, journals, songs, videos, records of our being, attempts to say, we were here, we lived, we felt, we wondered. A person takes a picture of a sunset and posts it online. That is a stone. A child draws their home with crayons and tapes it to the refrigerator. That is a stone. Someone writes down their thoughts in a notebook and hides it in a drawer. That is a stone. We build not only with hands but with hearts. We try to make something that stays after us, something that holds the shape of our presence. In the ancient world, stones were stacked to form circles, temples, monuments, not because they needed to be grand, but because people needed reminders that life mattered, that their brief time on earth was part of a longer story. That memory could live outside the body. Today we build timelines, archives, digital footprints. We leave behind words, images, traces of touch and voice. These are our cairns, our structures of meaning. And still, much of life is lived between the two, between the infinite and the immediate, between sky and earth. That is where the human experience has always taken place. When a child asks, "What is beyond the stars?" they are a stargazer. When that same child places stones in a circle in the dirt just to make something that stays, they are a stone builder. We do not teach this. It is remembered. We dream of the future. We imagine what could be. But we also preserve the past. We build museums to hold objects of our ancestors. We restore temples in old cities. We write history books, not just to learn, but to feel connected, to feel continuity, to feel that we are part of something longer and larger than our individual lives. Even in small, ordinary moments, the ancient patterns still live. A person lights a candle on a quiet evening. Flame flickers, shadows dance. That is the same firelight that flickered against cave walls tens of thousands of years ago. A person sits beside someone they love, says nothing, simply shares presence. That is the same warmth that once kept early families alive through winter. A person looks at the moon and feels something unnameable move inside them. That is the same feeling that stirred the first storytellers. Though our tools have become more complex, the essence of our longing has stayed simple. We want to belong. We want to understand. We want to love and be loved. We want to remember and be remembered. We want to feel the world and know that our lives are not just brief sparks lost in darkness. We want meaning, and meaning does not come from speed or accumulation or progress. It comes from attention, from noticing what is already here, from remembering what humanity has carried for thousands of years. We still gather around light, screens now instead of flames, but the instinct is the same, to gather together, to share stories, to feel connection. We still look to the sky when we are lost. We still walk to the water when we are grieving. We still look for beauty when we are tired. We still give flowers to say what words cannot speak. We still hold each other when fear becomes heavy. These gestures are ancient. They are not inventions. They are inheritances. Some part of us knows that to be human is not to achieve endlessly, but to feel deeply, to touch the world and be touched by it. And though cities rise and fall, though languages shift, though generations pass, the experience of being human remains remarkably constant. A heart beats. A breath moves, a mind wonders, a hand reaches, a tear falls, a smile warms, the stars turn, the sun rises, the moon fades, the earth rotates, and we live inside that eternal rhythm. Whether we notice it or not, we are not as far from our ancestors as we sometimes believe. We carry their memories in our bodies, in the shape of our bones, the rhythm of our breath, the instinct to look up. We carry their longing in our dreams, the desire for meaning, for connection, for belonging. We carry their tears when we mourn and their laughter when we celebrate. The past is not behind us. It is within us, and the future is not separate from the past. It unfolds from the same longing. We are still searching the infinite. We are still building on the earth. We are still both sky and soil, both wonder and memory, both dream and structure. The tools changed, the longing didn't. And maybe, beneath all the complexities of modern life, beneath the noise and the speed, beneath the striving and the exhaustion, what we are really trying to do is remember. Remember how to look up. Remember how to build something that matters, not just something that lasts. Remember how to be human, not better, not greater, not more impressive. Just human, stargazer and stone builder, dreamer and maker, wanderer and rememberer. Still here, still reaching, still belonging to the same sky that watched the first fires, the first songs, the first footprints on earth. We are still doing both. We always have been, and the longing continues, steady as the stars, patient as the stones. Before we end, it's worth pausing, really pausing, and feeling what remains. After all the stories, the stones, the stars, the silence, what lingers is not simply knowledge. It is a feeling, a hum beneath the noise of time, a reminder that we are part of something much older, much slower, and much kinder than we remember. History, when seen gently, is not a record of kings or wars or inventions. It is a record of touch, of hands building, eyes looking, hearts wondering. A record of people who lived without knowing we would ever remember them, yet who shaped the world so quietly that their echoes still ripple through us. They built monuments not to be admired, but to belong. They watched stars not to escape, but to understand. And somewhere in the long corridor of time, we inherited both of those instincts, the reaching upward and the grounding downward. We are still doing both, even now. Every age believes itself to be new. But if we look closely, if we step outside the current of speed and listen carefully, we can feel that nothing essential has ever changed. We still build. We still dream. We still ache for meaning. The stars above our cities are the same stars that glowed above the first fires. The rhythm of our breath is the same rhythm that filled the lungs of those who carved stones, who sang to the dawn, who whispered to their children about gods and seasons. We live in continuity, though we often pretend to live in progress. Tupi. Look back is not nostalgia. It is remembering. It is remembering that the world once moved slowly, and that slowness had wisdom. That work was once connected to need, not identity. That stories were once medicine, not content. That wonder was once daily, not rare. And that meaning was not hidden. It was everywhere, waiting patiently to be noticed. Our ancestors did not have much by modern measure, yet they had what many of us now chase endlessly: belonging. Belonging not only to each other but to the world itself. They did not stand apart from the land. They were part of it. They understood that to live was not to dominate or define, but to participate, to move within the cycles that already existed. And in doing so, they found a kind of peace that our accelerated lives often overlook. We have inherited their world, but not always their patience. We move faster, speak louder, want more, reach further, and yet, what we long for is still the same. We want to know that our lives matter, We want to feel connected to something vast but gentle. We want to create, to remember, to be remembered. We want to love and to be seen. We want to find home, even if we have to build it with our own hands. That longing is ancient. And though it takes new forms, careers, art, technology, exploration, it is the same old thread pulled through time, unbroken. Perhaps that is what all of history truly is, the unfolding of a single longing, the longing to understand why we are here, the longing to shape the invisible into something we can touch, the longing to transform passing time into memory that lasts. Our tools have changed. Our cities glow brighter, our maps are filled in, but our hearts are still wild with questions. We still gaze upward, still whisper wishes into the dark, still trace meaning in constellations, whether those constellations are stars or data points or dreams. And we still build homes, monuments, archives, digital worlds, hoping that in the act of making, we might leave a trace of who we were. When the first humans carved patterns into bone, they were not just decorating, they were remembering. When they placed stones upright in circles, they were not only marking the passage of the sun, they were making sense of their own passage through life. When they looked up and named the stars, they were not only mapping the sky, they were mapping themselves. We are not so different. Our circles now are digital networks. Our carvings are written in pixels. Our stars are distant signals on screens, yet they still make us pause and feel small in the best way. We are still searching for the same thing, connection that endures beyond the brevity of one life. And maybe, in this recognition, we find humility, to know that we are not the peak of history, but its continuation, that we are not apart from the ancient world but part of its echo, that the wisdom of slowness, of wonder, of community still lives in us, even when buried under noise. We carry ancient memory in our modern bones. The urge to build is there. The urge to look up is there. The longing is there. We have simply learned to name it differently. Every generation thinks it is moving forward, yet the stars do not move. They watch. They witness. They shine with the same quiet certainty they have always had. They remind us that forward is not the only direction. Sometimes meaning is found in stillness. Sometimes progress is simply remembering what has been forgotten. When the first fires were lit, people gathered around them to share warmth and story. The flicker of light on faces, the hush of night around them, the feeling of being together. These things made life sacred. Today, our fires are smaller, hidden inside our screens, but the instinct remains. To gather, to share, to connect, to not be alone in the dark. The form changed. The flame did not. When the first stones were raised, it was not for spectacle. It was for continuity, to bridge what fades, to give shape to gratitude, grief, and awe, to remind the living that they were part of something longer than their lifetimes. Now our monuments are digital, our memorials made of data, but the gesture is the same. We still build against forgetting. We still build to remember. We still build to feel less temporary. And when the first humans looked up, they saw patterns and called them stories. They imagined heroes, gods, lovers, and beasts. They found in the vastness a mirror of their own hearts. We still do this. We name galaxies, send telescopes into the void, and wait for answers that might never come. But the point was never just to find, it was to seek, to feel awe, to be reminded that there are things beyond comprehension, and that this mystery is not a threat, but a gift. That is what the stars teach us. Patience, humility, wonder. That is what the stones teach us, yet endurance, connection, memory. And somewhere between the sky and the earth, between the dream and the work, between the gaze and the hand, humanity continues. Perhaps one day, far in the future, someone will look back at us, at our cities, our towers, our stories stored in invisible code, and feel the same wonder we feel when we touch ancient stones. They will not see perfection. They will not see conquest. They will see longing. They will see people who tried to understand their brief time beneath the stars, who tried to love, to build, to leave a trace of tenderness behind, and maybe that is enough. Maybe that has always been enough. Because to live is not to master the world. It is to marvel at it. To build is not to prove power. It is to shape gratitude. To look up is not to escape. It is to remember that we belong to something infinite. The stars do not rush, the stones do not move, and yet in their stillness they hold the story of everything. If we listen closely, if we slow down enough, we can still hear the quiet conversation between them. The sky whispering to the earth answering softly back. And somewhere between those two eternal voices, in the small space of human life, we are still here, building, gazing, remembering. Perhaps that is the true meaning of history, not a timeline of events, but a long meditation on wonder. A reminder that across every empire, every invention, every language and age, what has endured is not conquest but curiosity, not control, but care, not power, but presence. So before we go, maybe we can take one last look up, at the same stars that watched the first fires, at the same light that falls on forgotten ruins, at the same silence that has held every human, thought, hope, and dream. And we can whisper quietly, we remember, because we do. Even now, even here, we are still doing both, still stargazers, still stone builders, still dreamers, still makers, still longing, still human. And the sky, eternal, patient, infinite, still waits for us to look up.